There are moments when success feels untouchable when the skyline beneath your feet looks like proof that you've conquered the world, and then there are moments when a single signature, a single truth quietly rearranges everything you thought you owned. This is the story of how arrogance built a throne and humility dismantled it without ever raising its voice, so stay with me until the end. Because what happened inside one glass tower in downtown Chicago changed two lives forever and might just change the way you see power, pride, and redemption. At the very top of a 70-story steel and glass skyscraper, Adrian Cole stood in his corner office, adjusting his silver watch while watching the city pulse below him. Traffic moved like obedient lines of code, cranes dotted the horizon, and his company's logo glowed from neighboring buildings as if the city itself answered to him. Across a long walnut conference table sat his wife Elena Marlowe, dressed in a simple navy dress, no diamonds, no designer labels. Her hair pulled back neatly, her posture calm and almost detached. Adrian often mistook her simplicity for smallness, and that misunderstanding would cost him everything. 10 years earlier, they had met at a university entrepreneurship seminar. Adrian loud and magnetic, pitching bold ideas about scaling tech platforms globally before he was 30, Elena quiet, but incisive, asking questions about sustainability, labor ethics, and long-term accountability. He was drawn to her steadiness, she to his ambition, and when they married, friends described them as balance personified, fire and water, vision and wisdom. But as Cole Dynamics expanded from a startup into a billion-dollar infrastructure software firm, Adrian's ambition thickened into ego. Media interviews praised him as a visionary disruptor, investors toasted him at rooftop galas, and every article seemed to frame him as a self-made titan who had single-handedly rewritten the rules of his industry, while Elena, who had once reviewed contracts late into the night and offered thoughtful caution about debt exposure and compliance loopholes, found her advice increasingly brushed aside with a dismissive smile and a familiar phrase. "You don't understand how big this is going to be." What Adrian never bothered to understand was that Elena understood far more than he imagined, because Elena Marlowe was not simply a supportive spouse with a background in finance. She was the only daughter of Victor Marlowe, founder of Marlowe International Trust, a discreet but immensely powerful private equity consortium whose holdings quietly underpinned ports, energy grids, and venture funds across 4 continents. She had never flaunted that lineage, never corrected the magazines that labeled Adrian the primary architect of their wealth, because she had wanted something rare and fragile, to be loved without the distortion of status. The day the divorce papers appeared between them, the skyline looked no different, but something fundamental had shifted. Adrian slid the folder toward her with the calm confidence of a man convinced he was protecting what he built, explaining that the separation would be clean, efficient, and generous by any reasonable standard, that he would ensure she was comfortable, that this was simply the practical next step for 2 adults who had grown apart. Elena studied him with an expression that was neither wounded nor angry, just thoughtful, and asked softly, "Are you certain this is what you want?" Adrian interpreted her composure as resignation and nodded, reminding her that every asset had been structured carefully, that Cole Dynamics was insulated from personal claims, that he had advisors who anticipated every contingency. She listened, then signed her name with a steady hand, closed the folder, and wished him well, in a tone so sincere it unsettled him more than tears would have. Within weeks of the finalized divorce, Adrian accelerated a massive leveraged acquisition he had been planning for months. A bold move to dominate a European competitor and cement his legacy as the youngest CEO to triple market share in under 5 years. But the financing agreements he had rushed through contained clauses tied to debt consolidation triggers and majority stakeholder protections embedded deep within layered holding companies. Those holding companies, as it turned out, were partially owned by Marlowe International Trust, a fact Adrian had overlooked because he had never asked the right questions about who truly stood behind the capital he so confidently wielded. When market volatility spiked and revenue projections faltered, automated safeguards activated, transferring controlling debt positions to the trust. Emergency board meetings followed, investors demanded stability, and in a vote that took less than 20 minutes, Adrian Cole was removed as CEO of the company whose name he had treated like a crown. He felt blindsided, convinced there had been manipulation, until his legal counsel reviewed the contracts line by line and said words that echoed louder than any boardroom applause he had ever received. "These were the terms you approved. No one took anything from you." Regulatory scrutiny soon uncovered aggressive revenue Recognition tactics and compliance shortcuts Adrian had justified internally as temporary measures to sustain growth momentum. Lawsuits mounted, media narratives shifted from visionary to reckless, and the same commentators who once celebrated his daring now dissected his downfall with clinical detachment. Throughout it all, Elena remained publicly silent. She did not attend hearings, did not release statements, did not grant interviews hinting at betrayal or vindication. Instead, Marlowe International announced the launch of the Horizon Ethics Fund, an initiative designed to provide mentorship, legal guidance, and fair-rate financing to emerging entrepreneurs vulnerable to exploitative lending structures. And Elena now openly acknowledged as its chairwoman spoke at conferences about transparency, accountability, and the responsibility leaders carry when other people's livelihoods depend on their decisions. Years passed and Adrian served a reduced sentence after settlements were reached regarding financial misconduct. There were no dramatic outbursts, no cinematic confrontations, just the quiet unraveling of a man forced to confront the distance between his self-image and his choices. When he re-entered society, the city skyline looked unchanged, but he no longer saw it as a monument to his dominance. He saw it as a reminder of how quickly glass can shatter. Unable to return to executive life, he accepted work maintaining commercial properties, fixing lighting systems, polishing marble floors, ensuring that conference rooms were immaculate before strategy sessions he would never again lead. One evening, while setting up a grand ballroom for a philanthropic summit, he recognized a familiar voice resonating through the hall. Elena stood at the podium, poised and composed, addressing an audience of founders and investors about ethical scalability, explaining that growth without governance is erosion disguised as expansion, that true influence is measured not by how much control you exert, but by how responsibly you steward opportunity. And as she spoke, Adrian felt not bitterness but clarity, a realization that she had never orchestrated his collapse. She had simply allowed structures he ignored to function as designed. He remained in the shadows, listening, and for the first time fully grasped that his greatest vulnerability had never been market risk but unchecked pride. That night in a modest apartment far removed from penthouse views, he opened a notebook and began documenting every moment when ego had overridden counsel, every warning he had dismissed, every instance where he chose admiration over integrity. The exercise was humbling, sometimes humiliating, but also strangely liberating because ownership of failure removed the need for excuses. He enrolled in evening courses on corporate governance and ethical finance not to reclaim status, but to rebuild competence on a foundation of humility. He volunteered at community incubators, sharing candid lessons with aspiring entrepreneurs about the seductive nature of rapid success and the invisible fine print that can redefine ownership overnight. There were no headlines about his transformation, no viral redemption arc. Yet consistency replaced spectacle as he showed up week after week, choosing accountability over applause. Eventually, a modest envelope arrived at Horizon Ethics Fund headquarters containing a donation that was small by corporate standards, but significant by personal sacrifice, along with a handwritten note that read, "I once believed leadership meant being the loudest voice in the room. Now I understand it means listening before the room falls silent. Thank you for proving that consequences can become teachers." The note bore no signature, yet Elena recognized the handwriting and allowed herself a quiet smile. Not of triumph, but of acknowledgement that growth, when genuine, needs no audience. Pride can construct towers that scrape the sky, but without integrity they stand on fragile ground. Humility, though less visible, reinforces foundations that endure beyond market cycles and media praise. Adrian's journey did not restore his former wealth, nor did it erase the consequences of his decisions, but it reshaped the one asset he had long neglected: his character. Elena continued expanding initiatives that prioritized ethical entrepreneurship, mentoring leaders who understood that sustainable success requires more than ambition. It requires restraint, empathy, and respect for the systems that support expansion. Their paths rarely crossed again, yet both carried forward lessons forged in the same crucible of ambition and accountability. If this story resonates with you, if it reminds you that true strength is measured not by how high you rise, but by how responsibly you rise, then carry that reflection into your own decisions and subscribe to Voices of Kindness, where every story explores the quiet power of humility, the courage of accountability, and the transformative impact of choosing integrity over ego.